I'm here with Dr. Erin McKenna, who is a philosophy professor at the University of Oregon. Hi, Dr. McKenna. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, it's nice to be here.
There are so many different kinds of non-human animals. Do you think that some of these non-human animals are moral agents that belong in our moral community?
So I think they're all moral agents in a certain degree. So we know that within at least most large brain social mammals, but well beyond that, any social animal, they have rules of their own in their own communities. And in my mind, that makes them moral agents of a certain kind. Humans have tended not to recognize the moral agency of animals, and we've treated them purely as moral patients. So beings that we should care for, that we have full responsibility for, but that they are not in charge of their world. And I try and get people into the view of those particular animals and understand their evolutionary history, what their social systems are like, what their needs are, how they interact with each other, and then have humans learn some of what that animal community is about so that we can enter that respectfully. So in that sense, I think they're all agents, not in the same way that most moral theories would talk about it. And I don't see a hierarchy. So I know that in a lot of moral theory around animals, there's a hierarchy that is focused on what it is to be like us. So it's very anthropocentric is what we would call that. And so those animals that resemble humans enough get to be part of the moral community. And that's the kind of view that I actually am writing against. Because that just redraws lines. And this is the eco-feminist part of my view. We've been redrawing those lines repeatedly. Women weren't included in the moral community. Slaves weren't included in the moral community. Most people of color weren't in the moral community. We slowly extend, this is called moral extensionism, expand that circle, but we don't change what eco-feminists call the logic of domination, which is, if you're like me, you get to be in the moral community, but if you're too different, you don't. If you prove to me you're like me, I might let you in. And that's the way we've been handling this. And so we slowly expand. And even the history of women gaining access to the moral community required them to argue that they were not like animals. So we continue to put the rest of nature further outside the moral community in order to include more humans. And that, I think, is a basic error in understanding that humans are continuous with the rest of life. We're not separate. We're not completely different from or superior to it. And so in that sense, we need to really rethink what that moral community looks like more radically, in my opinion. I may have missed part of that question, but.
No, that was amazing. It left me with so many questions. So the easy stuff first. People call your view a pragmatist, eco-feminist, but what does that even mean?
So I was talking a little bit about the eco-feminist part, and I think the most important part of that for me is what I was just talking about, that eco-feminists are able to identify that we tend to separate the world into binaries, dualisms, black, white, male, female, nature, culture, and then we create a hierarchy and decide that one side of that binary is superior and can even control and use and dominate the other. And that's the logic of domination, when you get to see that somehow just by being in a certain category, you have that right. And so eco-feminists have been arguing that we need to explode the logic of domination, not move the pieces around. So women over time moved from the nature category, wild and uncontrollable, and some would argue moved to culture so they could be full citizens. But that didn't change the logic. It left the system in place. And so whatever was left in the nature category still was there to be controlled and dominated. So the eco-feminists want to say we've got to explode that whole way of thinking. Pragmatism is a school of thought that arises in the mid-1800s, following Darwin and the Civil War, in the US especially, with people like Charles Peirce, William James, John Dewey, Jane Addams, Elaine Locke, or some of the figures I talk about in the book that I think we're kind of focusing on. And there are a couple of things that they really stress that are compatible with eco-feminist views. But one is that if we take evolution seriously, the world is a changing place, not a static place. And so politics, ethics, ontology, all of that has to allow for that change to occur instead of trying to fix things in one place. So that changes all of philosophy and potentially the role of the philosopher. They understand humans as in a continuum with the rest of nature, not separate and above the rest of nature. They understand that we will make mistakes, that we're fallible, we don't have perfect knowledge. So we need to hold ideas tentatively rather than rigidly and dogmatically, and be open to experimentation and change. So when an idea is working well, we tend to go with it. But when it hits a roadblock, instead of holding on to that with what Peirce calls the method of tenacity, I'm just going to believe it anyway, even though it's not working well, we actually have to use critical intelligence, experiment, rethink, and come up with new ideas, and then habituate to those new ideas. So it's always fluid and moving. And ideas are to matter in the world for a pragmatist. And this is where sometimes people will call it pragmatic. And that has a more general meaning if you just look that up in the dictionary, which is what is practical, what I can accomplish, maybe even a negative term that I will sell out my ideals in order to get some result. But the pragmatists are not going that route, but they do think that ideas work in the world, and you judge an idea by the work it does in the world. And so when you combine that with the feminists who also think that theory really is connected to practice, you get a really powerful combination of putting philosophy to work in the world and having those ideas molded by the experiences of those ideas working in the world. So it's always a transactive relationship between the ideas and the experiences people have.
Putting all of those ideas together, it sounds like your contribution with your new book is not to just move the lines around between who gets counted and who doesn't, but to totally revolutionize the way humans interact with non-human animals. And so my next question is, what is the ethical relationship that you would have us adopt? According to you, what is a correct or ethical moral relationship for us humans and non-human animals?
So this is the part that many people will find dissatisfying about a pragmatist ecofeminist view, is there is not a correct view. It's going to be situational, it's going to be contextual, it's going to matter which human, which animal, what space and time. And so this is why it doesn't sell as well. So I don't come out and say everyone should be vegan or vegetarian. I can say industrial agriculture is highly problematic, morally, environmentally, monetarily, health-wise, I mean, a number of ways. But then I can't say, here is the diet everyone should follow, or here is the only way to respectfully interact with a pig or a wolf or a cow. That's going to vary. And pragmatism especially argues that we need a pluralistic approach. Because we're limited creatures and we're always missing things and are fallible, we have to have a diverse community of experiences in order to get things as good as we can. So they don't ever think we're going to get it perfectly right, but we can make things better if we allow for diversity within those ranges. So I will argue that in certain contexts, certain ways of eating, or maybe you test on animals in this context, but not that, but it's going to require critical inquiry into the problem at hand, the animals, the humans, the needs, and the approaches being taken. So there isn't an answer.
Okay, let me ask you a terrible question. Some non-human animals, they're treated really well. I'm thinking about dogs and cats in America. Like there's even dog hotels, dog grooming. And some of them are not treated very well, like birds that we don't go and feed when we could. There's other birds we do feed, like beautiful hummingbirds, but we don't feed, pigeons on the mass scale. And there's some non-human animals that we treat very, very badly, like many cows, we chickens, we let them live just long enough to kill them. And I was going to ask, what are the differences between the animals themselves that get them categorized differently by us? But I guess you're going to say there is no difference. It's like an us problem.
I think it is an us problem, but there are probably differences in those animals that call out some of those human responses. So I started out to write one book on pragmatism and animals way back, and I realized I couldn't. So my first book was on pets. The second book was on livestock, and now I'm working on a book on wildlife. And my first thought was, as a pragmatist and a feminist, I had to start with the animals people are closest to, which are dogs and cats. And I included horses in that as well. They live with us, and we have an emotional attachment, and our good treatment of them is more about how we feel than really about the animal. And often what we're doing is not good for that animal. So some dogs do need a sweater because of how we've bred them. But when you're putting a sweater, I have an Australian Shepherd, if I put a sweater on them to decorate them, they would overheat, and it's not good. Many of our dogs and cats are obese. We love them to death, quite frankly. And one of the ironies is I end the pet book saying, if you love your dog and cat, you need to care about the animals they're eating, even if you don't eat them. And so you need to care about livestock, because pigs are probably more intelligent than most dogs by all measures. And yet we're willing to kill them to feed our dogs and cats and ourselves. There's no difference. It's just we've distanced ourselves from the pig. If you come to identify with a particular pig, you want to save them. And we have stories of pigs or cows getting out of a slaughter truck, and people cheer for their escape. And that's part of why I use children's literature in this book. So I talked about the book and the movie Babe, for instance, or Charlotte's Web. When you identify with the animal and they have a voice and they're individualized, then we have a different relationship. Once they're away from us, and now industrial agriculture is completely away from us, you're not allowed to see it, what's going on at the slaughterhouse. There's no individuality to the animal. It's much easier to think they're not deserving. Wild animals, I think, are an interesting one because they're far away from us, but often romanticized. But so wolves are romanticized, loved or hated, depending on perhaps whether you're a rancher or a hunter or someone living away from them. But coyotes are more universally hated, and we still see them as pests, and we try and kill them. And there's not a lot of difference between the wolf and the coyote, and certainly not in terms of intelligence, but that relationship and the stereotypes we get of the animals tends to push them into one category or another, and then it's hard to get them out. So once you've been labeled a pest or a nuisance animal or a dangerous predator, very hard to come back from that, as we see with wolves. What fairy tales tell us about wolves still holds over into people's perception of what's going on. And yet you live with a wolf if you're living with a dog in many ways. And so how can you love your dog and demonize the wolf? There are reasons for it, partly to do with livestock, mostly to do with livestock production. So I think it really is when we move to agriculture that we change our relationship with animals. And instead of working with them, we start to see certain ones as enemies and certain ones as friends. So the dog becomes a companion and a protector of livestock, and the wolf becomes an enemy of livestock. And that economic relationship we have to the livestock determines one being privileged and one being demonized.
On your view, are all non-human animals deserving of respect? I ask that because it seemed like you were saying that we should put an asterisk on the importance of the welfare of non-human animals and say it goes by context, some humans, some animals to some extent. But can you answer that general question about whether they all deserve respect, or is it too complicated to even answer that?
Yeah, I think they all deserve respect. That is pretty easy for me. What that plays out, so I think people often think that once I say they're deserving of respect, then I can't touch them, I can't use them, I can't eat them, I can't use them in biomedical research. And I follow an eco-feminist philosopher, Val Plumwood, who actually argues for respectful use. There is no way for humans to live, and for most animals to live, without the death of other beings, plants and animals, insects to carnivores. So that's a given. And people try and avoid that and try and not face up to that. Then the question is how you do it. And there can be a difference from hunting your own meat, if you're going to eat animals, to small scale farming, to the industrial agriculture. all have different issues with them. One could choose to not eat other animals, but even a plant-based diet will require either some animal inputs like manure or the death of some insects. We're always killing insects to protect our crops. We kill deer and elk and elephants all around the world to protect crops. So there's no way of eating that you are not implicated in the death of other animals, whether you're eating those animals or not. So the question is how to have respectful use and how to have a kind of reciprocity with the other animals. And I think that requires that we show some restraint in our consumption, which is not something that the US is known for. As a consumerist culture, we are gluttonous in our consumption in all ways, especially in food. And that comes at a great cost to the rest of nature, as well as to our own well-being.
So you say that animals, non-human animals, deserve respect. Is that, let's just assume you're right. They do, they all do. And I want to ask, why do they? Is it something about us, like we ought to respect them because of what we are? Or is it that all life deserves respect and so they respect? It's about the animal? Like, where does the respect come from?
So, and this is the hard part because we're just so programmed to think us, them. And we do, so someone like Kant would say we only have indirect duties to animals, that they are not inherently morally worthy. But if I kick a dog, I'm not a good person. I will become hardened and I might become the kind of person who would hit a human. But I don't have a moral duty directly to the dog. That's been quite popular way of looking at it.
So that would say that you have to respect the animal because of what you are.
That would be the Kant position, not my position. As a pragmatist, I see humans on a continuum with the rest of the other animals. And we know this now quite literally. I mean, genetically, we're on a continuum. We share microbiome. We are human in part because of what we've ingested. So those who've lived in agricultural societies where they're eating animals and drinking milk and eating cheese literally changed what people could digest and how your system works. We became immune to certain diseases because we got them from the cattle. So something like smallpox, very bad if you didn't live with animals. Humans who lived with those animals gained certain immunities. It changes what it is to be who we are. So the idea that we are something separate just makes no sense. And if I have respect for myself, then I need to have respect for all the kinds of critters out there who have helped make us who we are. And so they've made us literally in terms of our bodies, but also politically. Agriculture, transportation, all fueled by animals, early energy, burning of their manure, things like that. We could not be who we are socially, politically, biologically without the other animals. So even if you just want to think about humans, you have to start to have respect for the rest of life. I think once you start to do that, if you really get into the point of view of some of the other animals, you start to see we have a lot of similarities. There are some differences, and some of the differences are amazing. So we always think we're superior, but to be a dolphin and look through a body, that would be amazing, to just be able to see right through with echolocation. So they can see a pregnant woman's fetus just swimming around in the water. Eagles looking down. I mean, elephants hearing through their feet. There's so many things that we can't do and don't experience that we should be marveling at and trying to grasp and being humbled by.
Humans are on a continuum with the other living things, animals, and we owe them something. Do they owe us something? Do non-human animals owe some moral regard or something to humans the way that we owe them something as well?
So I think that depends on the kind of community, interspecies community you're in. We have to earn that. I don't think we're somehow often with Judeo-Christian views, God gave humans dominion, like he gave man dominion in some cases, and we're somehow the center, naming the animals and are in charge. Taking the evolutionary perspective, that doesn't work for me. If I'm in a close relationship, there are probably something living with dogs, there are certain things they might want to do, but they don't do out of regard for my preferences. But I think I owe them that I give into their preferences as well. And that varies by the species, by the breed, by the individual. So I've had lots of Australian Shepherds, certain things they have in common, but very different individualities and preferences. And I believe the humans have to adapt much more to the animals they live with than we have. We tend to want the cat or dog to adapt to whatever lifestyle we have. And it's got to be mutual. If it's not mutual, then I don't think the other animal owes you much respect because you're not respecting them. And a lot of animals have been very harmed by us. And so if we've been hunting your kind vociferously, you probably don't have a lot of respect for us. And there's evidence, like the Galapagos Islands is a great one, where humans had not been present and hunting these animals, they walk right up. Even animals that could be dangerous to humans are not showing aggression. Animals that would normally be afraid in other places don't. So we have created a lot about our relationships with these other animals and then demonize the animal for not caring about us. So we have to earn it. But I do think there are many places where you do earn that kind of regard from the other animal.